What happens when the person who gave up everything for family finally says, no more? For 40 years, Lillian Monroe was the silent backbone, raising siblings, giving up dreams, putting everyone first. But what if one quiet woman suddenly chooses herself? This is not just a story about family. It's about awakening. And once Lillian opened her eyes, she could never go back. The wooden floor of Lillian Monroe's cottage creaked beneath her slippers as she walked toward the kitchen, carrying a chipped ceramic mug of chamomile tea. The late afternoon sun cast soft golden rays through the lace curtains, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like whispers of the past. Outside, the Wando River flowed quietly by, just as it had every day of her life in Charleston. Lillian was 66 years old, with silver hair always tied back in a neat bun, and hands calloused not by hard labor, but by years of quiet service, to everyone but herself. She lived alone now, in the same riverside house she had inherited decades ago. The walls were covered with faded photographs of her 4 younger siblings. In each picture, Lillian stood in the background, smiling, holding a cake, adjusting a tie, always making room for someone else to shine. As the eldest of 5, Lillian had taken on responsibility before she even understood what the word meant. Their mother died of cancer when Lillian was just 19. Their father followed only 2 years later, collapsing from a heart attack while on a fishing trip. Grief didn't give Lillian the luxury of mourning. There were mouths to feed, homework to check, and lights to keep on. So she shelved her dreams of becoming a ceramic artist and took a job at the Charleston County Public Library. The pay was modest but steady. It was enough to pay the bills and send her siblings to school. Her mornings were filled with the scent of dusty books and whispering readers, her evenings with the clatter of dishes and late-night laundry. Over the years, Lillian helped her sister Nora open a beauty salon, co-signing the loan under her own name. She helped her brother James buy his first home, draining her modest savings to cover the down payment. "You've always been the strong one, Lil," they'd say. "We couldn't have done it without you." But somehow, they never offered to help her. Now, retired and childless, Lillian spent her days tending a small garden in the backyard, reading poetry, and taking slow walks by the water. Her body moved slower, but her mind had grown sharper, more restless. She began to question, quietly without bitterness, where her life had gone. On a chilly October morning, she opened a box she hadn't touched in years. Inside were sketches of pottery designs from her 20s, clippings of ceramic workshops she had once dreamed of attending, and a long-forgotten acceptance letter from the Savannah College of Art and Design. Her fingers trembled as she held the envelope, yellowed and fragile. She had been accepted. She had just never gone. The next day, her sister Nora called. "Lil, I was wondering if you could help me again," Nora said cheerfully. "The salon's been slow and I've fallen behind on the rent. Just for a couple months, until things pick back up." Lillian stared out the window. The wind rustled the maple trees, their leaves a fiery orange. She could feel a shift inside her, subtle yet unrelenting, like the current beneath the river's surface. "Nora," she said gently, "I think this time, I have to say no." There was silence on the line. Then a scoff. "Seriously? After everything we've done together?" Lillian smiled sadly. "That's just it. It's always been we, when it was mostly me." For the first time in her life, she hung up mid-conversation. Later that evening, she walked down to the riverbank, a blanket over her shoulders. The cold air nipped at her skin, but she felt strangely warm inside. She picked up a piece of driftwood and began to draw in the damp sand. Her hands remembered the movement, the curve here, a hollow there, the beginning of a vase. She hadn't touched clay in 45 years, but in that moment, something long buried began to stretch and stir. She whispered to the wind, "Maybe it's not too late after all." It was the first Sunday of April, the kind of day when Charleston seemed to breathe a little softer. Cherry blossoms lined the sidewalks, and the sun filtered through the trees like melted gold. Lillian Monroe stood at the edge of her porch, a homemade peach cobbler wrapped in a tea towel tucked under her arm. She had baked it the same way her mother did, cinnamon heavy, the crust just slightly burned at the edges. She arrived at Nora's house promptly at 1 p.m. for the family lunch, They'd planned weeks in advance. Everyone was already there. James, with his booming voice and baseball cap still on indoors. Nora, in her usual too-tight blouse and cell phone glued to her hand. Carla, the youngest, bustling between kitchen and living room like she owned the place. Lillian felt out of place before she even crossed the threshold. The lunch was loud, full of overlapping conversations and jokes that left her sitting silently at the end of the table. She waited for a pause, waited for someone to say, "Lillian, how have you been?" No one did. When the plates were cleared and coffee poured, she cleared her throat and folded her hands on the table. Her fingers were trembling. "I've been thinking," she began softly. "I want to sell the plot of land on Rutledge Avenue." That got their attention. The room fell unusually quiet. James leaned back in his chair. "You mean the one Mama and Daddy left?" Lillian nodded. "Yes. It's in my name, and it's just sitting there. I want to use the money to fix up the cottage. Maybe travel. Take a pottery class I've been meaning to attend." James chuckled, the sound cutting through the room like a dull blade. "What's a 66-year-old woman going to do with all that money? Travel to where? You ain't got kids. That land's basically for us anyway." Carla didn't even meet her eyes. "We've all used that land, Lil. It wouldn't be fair for you to sell it like that. You're living fine in your little house." Nora set down her mug. "You don't need much, sweetie. We're the ones with mortgages, kids, businesses. It makes more sense for us to divide it." Lillian's heart dropped. She looked around the table, searching for a face that would defend her. There was none. Her mouth opened to speak, but no words came out. All she could hear was the echo of her own silence, decades of it. The years spent standing in lines at the bank co-signing loans, quietly mailing checks to cover someone else's emergency. The nights she skipped dinner so James could buy textbooks. The countless holidays she worked double shifts at the library so her siblings could host dinner with their children. And now they were telling her she didn't matter, that her dreams, her needs, her life were secondary. She stood up slowly, the wooden chair scraping against the tile floor like a whisper of protest. "I'm sorry," she said. "I thought, never mind." James shrugged. "Come on, don't take it personally." But how could she not? She left without finishing her coffee, cobblers still untouched on the counter. That evening, back at the cottage, the silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. Lillian sat at the small kitchen table, staring at her worn hands. The skin was thin, lined with age, but steady. These were the hands that had bathed her siblings, cooked every Sunday meal, signed every check. She reached for a manila folder she hadn't touched in years, pulling it from the top shelf of the hallway closet. Inside were documents, the title to the Rutledge land, letters from the bank, old promissory notes written by James and Nora for loans she had taken out in her name. None of them repaid. Not even acknowledged. At the bottom was a copy of her mother's will. It was clear. The land was left solely to Lillian. Her mother had written in her neat cursive, "For Lillian, with gratitude. May this land be a seed for whatever future she chooses." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. Her mother had seen her, had known. Her heart beat louder than the ticking clock on the wall. That night, she didn't sleep. She drafted a letter to her lawyer, requesting an official appraisal and beginning paperwork for sale. Then she opened her laptop, something she barely used, and began to search for pottery retreats. One in Asheville caught her eye. It was a 6-week residency, nestled in the mountains. She bookmarked it. Just before dawn, she stood in front of her mirror, her eyes red but determined. For the first time in her life, Lillian whispered aloud the question no one had ever asked her. "What do you want, Lillian?" Tears welled up. But they were not from sadness. They were from awakening. Lillian Monroe closed the front door behind her, the familiar creak echoing through the empty hallway of her cottage. The hush felt heavy. The evening light filtered through lace curtains, casting pool shadows on the hardwood floor. She held the folder on her lap, the brown manila cover as unassuming as its contents were powerful. For 2 decades, she'd kept these papers tucked away in her bedroom's built-in safe, documents she had collected in quiet moments of generosity, not realizing how fateful they'd become. She closed her eyes and took a slow, deliberate breath. Her heart felt tender but steady, not racing. Determination filled the stillness. Door opening the past. The safe clicked softly as she opened it. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old pine. Paper rustled in her hands. She knew what was inside, but the weight of it pressed on her differently now. She was no longer a caretaker coloring within someone else's outline. Tonight, she was standing in her own light. She laid out the documents on her dining table, turning on the overhead lamp. Shadows retreated. First, the promissory note from Nora. I, Nora Monroe, owe my sister Lillian Monroe $15,000 for initial salon setup. I agree to repay within 10 years, interest-free. Signed, Nora Monroe, March 3, 2005. Ink slightly smudged from tears presumably shed in haste, a physical reminder. Second, the land title. It was crisp, official. Parcel ID 005-32-110. Title held by Lillian Monroe, sole heir to Gibson Monroe family estate. But the quietest shock was the ledger, rows of bank transfers. May 2008, $10,000, Charleston Savings, loan to James Monroe. August 2012, $8,500, repayment James to Greenville Trust, mortgage payoff. November 2016, $5,000, loan to Nora Monroe, delayed salon expenses. February 2018, $12,000, mortgage assistance. Not once had any amount been returned. Not a single cent. A lifetime of giving, unbalanced. Lillian's lips parted. She remembered those days. The phone calls, the urgent texts, the deadlines, James about to lose his house, Nora's salon on the brink, Carla's emergency trip home when her daughter fell ill. She didn't mourn the memories, she felt quiet rage. Not loud anger. Simmer that said, "You took, and never gave back." Her throat tightened. She ran her fingers over the title document again. Her mother's handwriting, faded but clear, said, "For Lillian with love. May this land be more than a memory." That land. Her land. A living testament. Meeting the lawyer. The next morning, she sat in her Toyota, folder on her lap, outside Anderson and Hayes, attorneys at law, nestled on King Street. Her reflection stared back. Silver bun, humble cardigan, quiet dignity. Inside the waiting room, leather chairs smelled of coffee and leather polish. A receptionist barely glanced up as she signed in. Minutes later, a door opened. Mark Hayes, a kindly middle-aged lawyer with salt and pepper hair, emerged. "Ms. Monroe?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, that's me. Thank you for seeing me." The discussion. They walked into a small office, book-lined and sunlit. Mark gestured to a chair. She sat, hands clasping the folder. He opened a fresh notepad. "Tell me what you want, Ms. Monroe." She leveled her gaze. "I want what's mine, legally, fairly. I want to sell the Rutledge Avenue land, and I need to know how to do it." Mark nodded and then paused. "That's simple enough. But based on what you've told me, I think there's more to consider." He took her documents, scanning them briefly. This promissory note and the records of the loans, he tapped the ledger. These show clear financial transactions. That's powerful evidence. Combined with your sole title to the land, you have a strong legal position. Lillian exhaled. Relief rippled beneath her ribs. Mark continued, "I can draft a repayment request to your siblings, formal, with a due date. If they refuse, we can move to lien enforcement or legal judgment. They'll have to either repay or cede their claim." Lillian felt that slow burn of empowerment again. "I want to do this right. I just want fairness." He smiled. "You're doing more than right. You're being just." An unexpected conflict. 2 days later, Lillian received an envelope. Inside was a note from Nora, handwritten. "Lillian, I don't understand what you're doing. You're selling the family land. We needed that for our future. I thought you cared about all of us." James sent a text. "This is ridiculous, Lil. Family doesn't pull this." When she saw the messages, something inside shifted. Their words felt small. They wanted her back in the old pattern. Silent, giving, invisible. But she realized something profound. They were threatened. Not by her selling land, but by her finally saying no. She was rewriting the story, and it rattled them, taking back her power. The night before her first official meeting with her siblings, Lillian lit a candle in her kitchen. It flickered against the wood walls as she looked at her reflection in the window. She thought of her mother's handwriting. She thought of her long-forgotten sketches. She thought of the many sacrifices she'd made. And for the first time, she said aloud, "I'm not just a caretaker. I'm not just a giver. I am a woman with dreams, with worth." She opened the folder, carefully organized each document, sealed them in an envelope to hand over at their meeting. She didn't tremble. She didn't apologize. She just stood in her own truth. The family meeting. The next afternoon, the siblings gathered at Lillian's cottage. The river whispered outside. Nora and James sat at her dining table, faces pale but determined. Mark joined as her legal advocate, calm and professional. Lillian showed no fear. "I sent you copies of these documents 2 days ago," she began. "These loans are real. They were never repaid. The land is mine. I intend to sell it or develop it." Nora's hands shook. James's face reddened. They floundered. They asked if there was room to negotiate. They mentioned family, legacy, guilt. Lillian didn't relent. She listened, then said quietly but firmly, "If you repay what you owe or make equal contribution, you can stay part of what comes next. But the choice you must make." It was a pause pregnant with power. The calm after the storm. Her siblings left in silence. The day closed gently. The river still moved. The trees swayed in wind and memory. Lillian sat by her kitchen table, candlelight soft on paper. She quietly cleared the dishes from their meeting. She rinsed cups, wiped cake crumbs, and washed hands. The ritual felt cleansing. At dusk, she carried her sketchbook and rolled clay onto her lap. Her fingertips pressed into the cool earth. The wheel began to spin, softly. The vase took shape, taller, stronger. It was imperfect, like her journey, but it stood upright. Dawn of a new beginning. That night, after bed, Lillian dreamt. Not of her siblings. Not of the land. But of firelight and pottery kills. Of classes filled with women who had been quiet too long. Of their voices, their stories. She woke with the sunrise. And she knew. This wasn't just about land or money. It was about claiming her own life. And letting that claim ripple outward. The rumor spread like wildfire, cutting through the quiet streets of Charleston and reaching Lillian's doorstep. In the post office, Mrs. Baker's voice was hushed and judgmental. "You're really selling that land, Lillian? After all this time?" When Lillian simply nodded, the older woman's sympathy evaporated. "I suppose at your age you get impulsive." At the grocery store, the clerk scanned her butter and ham. Without looking up, he mumbled, "Thought you were sweet, Mrs. Monroe. Didn't expect whatever this is." Even in the local gardening club, where Lillian had volunteered for years, the usual warm greetings were replaced by curt nods. One afternoon, Mrs. Patel stood beside her amid the rose bushes, leaf pruning shears in hand. This terrain was community treasure. Feels shameful to lose it. Her eyes flicked away. It felt like walking into winter without a coat, isolating, unexpected. Lillian felt the weight of whispers, wagging eyebrows, judgment feigning concern. The warmth she once felt in community had turned brittle. Speech balloon words that wound. Then came the harshest critique, from the lips of her own sister, Nora, in a message left on Lillian's voicemail. "Lillian, you're destroying what Papa and Mama built. You're choosing money over family values. Shame on you." Her niece Carla said over iced tea, "It just seems so rude. You never were like that." Lillian's world of kindness felt fragile now, cracked by accusations of greed. She pressed trembling fingers to her throat, feeling ashamed, but also something deeper, her heart lit by the realization that this was exactly why she had to stand firm. Anger bubbled beneath guilt. Beneath her exhaustion, she saw the clear mirror. They couldn't condemn what this had never really belonged to them. They'd nearly erased her all her life, and now they were surprised she dared to draw boundaries. Love letter, a letter of validation. On that night, flooding grief and doubt, Lillian found an envelope waiting at the kitchen table. The handwriting was familiar. Clara, her university roommate from 50 years ago. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside, a letter penned in looping script. Dear Lillian, I haven't written in years, but I've read about your decision to sell the Rutledge land. I cried when I read it, not because you lost something, but because you finally claimed who you were meant to be. I admired you once for your selflessness, but now I understand your courage. It takes strength to say, I deserve this. You are my sister in kindness and bravery. Love always, Clara. Lillian's eyes blurred, but these were not tears of defeat. They were release. For the first time in her life, someone outside her immediate life saw her, really saw her, and thanked her for choosing herself. Sitting in the solitude of her aged cottage, she wept. Each tear washed away decades of self-denial. She wept because for once she felt seen, heard, validated. Sheaf of rice reclaiming identity. The next morning, Lillian moved through her routine with renewed energy. The garden glowed under her tender care. The scent of fresh mint and lavender carried through the air. She paused to inhale deeply, letting the breeze settle her nerves. She made coffee and placed the letter on the table beside her legal documents. Then she did something unusual, something she'd never done before. She wrote her name in her sketchbook. The letters were uneven but deliberate. It was her signature, not borrowed, not silent. Her own. Conversation with Mark, the lawyer. That afternoon, she met Mark for a brief update. His office, with its lined bookshelves and warm lighting, felt like solid ground. Your siblings have not responded, he said gently, sliding the files back. No payment. They're buying time. Lillian nodded. She had expected this. She folded her hands. Then we proceed, right? Yes. We file notice of intent. They'll either comply or we move to legal judgment. She exhaled. Both relief and sadness. Mark paused. It's not easy, Lillian. She smiled, small but certain. At least now it'll be honest. Support from unexpected places. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. Community members who had judged now began writing to her. Some apologized. Others offered assistance, financial advice, real estate appraisals, even pottery workshop ideas to diversify her options. Mrs. Patel sent over a box of homemade bread and a note. I still don't quite get it, but I respect your backbone. A local newspaper journalist called, requesting an interview, not out of gossip, but out of interest for a local woman challenging norms at her age. The Gardeners Club invited her back, not to criticize, but to share her story. She showed up, tentatively, and was met with applause. Microphone community event, a new stage. One evening, Lillian stood before a modest crowd at the community center auditorium. A spotlight illuminated her silver hair and resolute stance. She cleared her throat. Thank you for coming. I'm here because I did something unusual, something many call selfish. I put myself first. Murmurs rippled through the audience. She held their gaze. But I'm not talking about greed. I'm talking about boundaries. About recognizing your own value even when no one else does. She shared her own story, the sacrifices, the silent years, the moment she found the promissory notes and stood at her dining table, heart pounding, ready to speak for herself. I realized I had spent 40 years giving without rest, never asking for what I truly deserved. And I understand now that self-care isn't selfish. It's survival. The audience listened in a hush. Afterward, people lined up to hug her, to tell their own stories, most tearful, always grateful. Some were elderly women who had lost their property to caring for family. Others were estranged daughters. For the first time, Lillian saw that she wasn't an outsider. She was trailblazing a broader message. Age is not an excuse for suppression. It's a reason for reclamation. Moments of silent reflection. Late that night, Lillian sat by the riverbank again, the same driftwood piece beside her feet. She carved a single pot petal into the wood, delicate, trembling lines meeting with purposeful arcs. The river's flow and the wood's curve seemed in harmonious dialogue, permanence and motion, letting go with grace. She thought of Clara, of the audience, of callers who told her she had inspired them. She thought of her siblings, still unrepentant, still refusing to pay. She thought, it is okay. It is okay to want more. It is okay to say no. It is okay to live the next chapter for herself. The evening sky darkened. Fireflies flickered in the tall grasses. The world felt both endless and intimate. Dawn of a new self. At sunrise, Lillian awoke without dread. The land was still hers, but she was no longer captive to invisible chains. She worked softly in the kitchen, made oatmeal for herself, and later walked to the garden. She touched the rosemary, the sage, the blooms she had planted decades earlier. All of them, thriving, fragrant, purposeful. She paused, closed her eyes, and whispered, "I choose me." Word spread that event at the center went viral locally. The journalist published the article titled, "Charleston Woman Stands Up at 66, It's Never Too Late to Choose Yourself." Letters poured in, from young women feeling pressure to always comply, from men recently widowed, recognizing their own invisibility, from neighbors saying, "I was wrong to judge, thank you." Lillian rarely spoke of revenge. She spoke of release. Her transformation had been quiet: walks at dawn, hands tracing clay, sleepless nights reading documents. But the impact was resonant. Within weeks, Lillian's name became associated with wisdom and empowerment, not weakness. She received invitations to speak at women's retreats. She was asked to host a podcast about boundaries and elder rights. She was even approached by an upcoming documentary about aging in America and reclaiming agency in later life. Her pulse quickened at the thought, not in fear but excitement. She arranged an introductory call. She could tell already, this was another way to amplify a message she cared about deeply. The sale of the Rutledge Avenue land closed on a crisp June morning. Lillian Monroe signed the final papers at the bank, her pen steady, her heart unshaken. The land alone had settled her modest mortgage, but more importantly, it unlocked a new chapter. The cashier handed her a check with a polite nod. She folded it gently, as though handling fragile hope. Finding the space. Within a week, Lillian discovered a quaint red brick building on Cedar Street, its windows dusty but intact, its historic charm waiting to be awakened. Vines crawled along the facade. Inside, the floors creaked and walls needed fresh paint. But Lillian saw possibility, not decay. She entered alone, the floorboards murmuring under her footsteps. She placed her palms against the peeling plaster and sighed, imagining laughter in the open room, clay on tables, tea brewing, stories shared. Transformation begins. She spent the next month elbow-deep in renovations. Early mornings found her painting walls a warm shade of dove gray. At midday, she rolled out tables for pottery wheels and bookshelves. An old chandelier was rewired. The garden in back, once overgrown, bloomed again under her careful hands. Lavender, rosemary, wild lilies. Neighbors watched with curiosity. Some waved, others shook their heads. But in Lillian's mind, each brushstroke and plant purchase whispered, "This is for you, Lillian. For us, all of us who've been silent too long." Grand opening of the Willow Room. One Sunday in late August, Lillian unlocked the front door early. She arranged handmade signs. "Welcome to the Willow Room, a safe haven for women seeking renewal." A small table held bowls of sugar cubes and herbal tea samples. She paused. She felt vibrations of both excitement and fear. At 10 a.m., the first guests trickled in, curious older women who remembered her from the gardening club. They admired the new pottery studio, cozy reading corner, and the back courtyard. Soft jazz played from hidden speakers as they mingled quietly at first. Lillian greeted each by name, offering tea and warm smiles. She didn't mention the land sale or the lawsuits. She let the space speak first, safe, dignified, intentional. Pottery for beginners, her first class. That afternoon, the first pottery class gathered around 3 wheels. Lillian demonstrated clay wedging fluidly, though her joints ached as she repeated movements. She caught her reflection in the window, silver hair, bent shoulders, but eyes alight with purpose. She remembered herself at 20, clay-stained and hopeful. Now, at 66, she welcomed others into that dream. One student, Clara, not her old friend, a widow whose husband had died suddenly, asked timidly, "Do I need talent to make something beautiful?" Lillian smiled gently, placing a lump of clay in her hands. "No. You need courage. The clay will follow." They squeezed, pressed, shaped. Laughter and sighs filled the otherwise hushed room. The meaningful ritual. By October, the Willow Room's events included tea circles, writing prompts, craft days, and quiet reflection time. Lillian attended each, learning the names and stories of neighbors who opened up, grief, loneliness, rediscovery. She hosted a reading evening. Women shared personal writings, poems, journal entries, memories. A hush fell over the room when one older woman described losing her child to addiction. Voices trembled, tears fell. There in that airy space, healing began. Lillian watched as hands reached across tables. She felt the power of letting others see her too, just as Clara had seen her years ago. A story of connection. One Saturday, Lillian gathered her paint-stained hands and cleared her throat. "Thank you all for coming today. I want to share why I created this place." She paused as eyes turned toward her, curious, gentle. 20 years ago, after my parents passed, I bought this brownstone and spent decades caring for others. Sisters, brothers, their dreams came first. Mine stayed buried in clay and worn paper. She inhaled slowly, heart pounding. "I sold land that meant a lot, yes. But it helped me build this. A place where you were seen. Where your grief, your art, your stories matter." A hush settled. A woman in the back dabbed her eyes. Lillian closed with, "We've been silent too long. But here, your voice matters. Especially now, at this age." Afterward, heartfelt hugs flowed, tears shared, hands pressed against hers. She understood. She had given more than space. She'd given someone permission to show up for themselves. Facing the past. Only then did she decide to invite her siblings. She wrote letters. "Dear Nora, James, Carla, please join our community gathering next Saturday. You are welcome to see what your words and hurts have created." She didn't expect apologies. She didn't want gratitude. She only wanted them to see that something rooted in her dreams had become real. A quiet climax, sibling arrival. It was a brisk November morning when Nora and James entered the Willow Room. Nora looked smaller, her confident veneer gone. James stood more rigid than usual. The group settled. Lillian stayed calm. She showed them around, clay pots in varying stages, shelves of community writings, the back garden where rosemary thrived. They listened as other women shared their stories. "I lost my purpose after losing my husband. I never thought I'd make something I was proud of." "Norris." James covered her mouth. When the stories ended, Lillian spoke softly. "This place was born from what started as sacrifice. I stood in line for years to give others options. Now, I stand in line to be seen. I wanted each of you to witness this." James swallowed again. He stepped forward. "Lilith, you didn't understand. I'm sorry." Nora nodded, tear-stained. Without fuss, Lillian just said, "I'm glad you're here." They hugged. No dramatic speeches. Just presence. A silent victory. The room didn't erupt in applause. Instead, a quiet calm filled the space. Lillian felt it in her chest, a stone of validation lifting. She looked out the window at the garden, roses glimmering in autumn light. She inhaled and saw her dreams, not tasks, reflected back. Epilogue of this chapter. As the first winter frost settled outside, the Willow Room thrived. Women wove stories, shaped clay, sipped tea, laughed, cried. They painted stones together and wrote letters of self-compassion. Lillian never mentioned money, lawsuits, or sales. Instead, each day she asked guests, "What do you need today?" That simple question, echoed from a once silent woman, became a quiet legacy. Early on a Thursday morning, Lillian arrived at the cafe for her usual decaf and oatmeal. A young journalist from Charleston Herald recognized her, sliding over a folded copy of the paper with a bright smile. "Congratulations, Lillian. That story's your portrait on the front page. She opened it slowly. Her face stared back at her in the glossy image, silver hair slightly mussed, clay stains on her apron, and a serene smile that spoke of quiet conviction. Below it, reader's remarks. It's about time one of us chooses herself. I felt tears reading what she said about boundaries. She's an inspiration for us all. Lillian's heart fluttered, not from nerves but gratitude. She realized something profound. Her story mattered more than soil and clay. It was rippling outward. Doors opened. By the following week, a steady line formed at Willow Room's brick entrance. Over 50 women, aged 50 to 80, widows, divorcees, retirees, came seeking a space to talk, heal, simply be. They didn't all want pottery. Some joined reading circles, mindfulness mornings, or letter-writing workshops. Lillian added. Each session began with tea, warm blankets, and a prompt. What have you put off saying to yourself? Hands shook as they passed paper cups, or first words. Lillian watched them carefully. She had known silence intimately, but she began to see voices emerging in others. Quiet moments over shared tea. One afternoon, Lillian held a midlife letters class. She handed out pastel stationery and envelopes. The theme, write a letter of forgiveness to yourself. A woman named Marjorie, tearful and frail, kept rewriting her first sentence. Lillian sat beside her. You don't have to be perfect. That's the point. Marjorie nodded and wrote. I forgive myself for the years I put everyone else first. I forgive myself for forgetting that I mattered. When Lillian returned to her own seat, she hesitated. On the old oak table she had left blank stationery. For a moment, she considered writing her own letter. Instead, she looked at Marjorie, quiet, pen-dragging, and felt every emotion reverberate in her own heart. She realized the work she was doing wasn't just about land or clay. It was about transformation. Hers and theirs. Chorus forms. Word of mouth, paired with the article's online share, spread far beyond Charleston. Emails came, from Atlanta, Charlotte, even Florida. Women wrote, I wish I could start something like this. Your story gave me permission to ask for my own space. Thank you, Lillian. A filmmaker approached Lillian. We'd love to document your classes. Could be part of a series on everyday heroes. She hesitated, shy but aware that a new chapter demanded a bigger stage. She agreed. No spotlight glare, just authenticity and purpose. Lillian's own reflection. Late one evening, Lillian stood alone in the pottery room. The wheels were silent. The kiln cooled. Only one single tea light glowed. She touched a vase she had shaped earlier, a tall cylinder that was uneven, imperfect. She remembered shaping it, the uncertainty at her fingertips, the fear that it wouldn't stand upright. It stood. Soft tears gathered in her eyes. She realized that she, Lillian Monroe, who'd stood at the fringes of every family gathering, was now at the center of something real, something generational. She had found not only a community, but herself. Symbol without fanfare. In the months that followed, Lillian became a quiet symbol of reclamation. The local station featured her story. The number of women at the Willow Room doubled. She no longer felt like a caretaker, but a compass, steady, guiding, hopeful. When writer Mary Anderson interviewed her, she asked, what advice would you give women in their 60s who feel invisible? Lillian paused thoughtfully before answering. Your age is not your limitation, it's your permission. Permission to say no, to dream, to put yourself first. It is never too late to start. Her words echoed, not just in the room, but through readers, listeners, and women who heard it and paused. A real-life moment of quiet climax. In a Willow Room class, a woman named Ruth, 78, pressed her clay hands against her heart and began to cry. Ruth, I lost my husband 5 years ago. Thought my life was over. But here, looking at you living for yourself, I feel hope. Lillian drew Ruth into an embrace. Around them, students hushed in respect. For Lillian, that moment was the true peak. Not legal victories, not newspaper stories, but real connection. A woman whose journey reflected her own, finding new purpose, renewed life, renewed voice. Epilogue to Willowy Grace. By year's end, the Willow Room had outgrown its original clay studio. A garden patio was added, festooned with twinkling lights and a small kiln. Lillian started training others to lead classes under her guidance. She still lived alone in her cottage. Each morning she walked down the garden path, inhaling the first light of dawn. She paused by the river, the same river that had watched her childhood grief and adult awakening. Now it watched her quiet triumph. She touched the cold stonework of the pottery, and whispered, "I stood for me. Now I stand with you." It was a soft golden Saturday afternoon in Charleston. Sunlight filtered lazily through the glass windows of the Willow Room, casting warm amber hues on the shelves lined with drying pottery. Lillian Monroe, now 66, stood at the head of the room wearing a linen apron speckled with clay and glaze. She held a simple bowl, spinning it gently between her palms. "Today," she said to her students, a small group of women in their 60s and 70s, "will be making gratitude bowls. Not for food, just a place to hold small blessings." The women smiled, nodding. Some adjusted their glasses, others rolled up sleeves. The soft hum of spinning wheels began. But just as Lillian bent to help one of the newer students with centering the clay, the front door creaked open. Two familiar figures stood at the threshold. Her sister, Jean, in a light floral blouse that Lillian remembered buying her 2 birthdays ago. And next to her, their youngest brother, Raymond, whose graying beard now betrayed the boyish mischief he once wore. The room went quiet. Even the wheels seemed to slow. Lillian looked up, clay still on her hands, heart thudding. The last time they'd spoken had been months ago, during a bitter exchange over the land sale. Their words back then weren't kind. Their absence since had been even louder. Jean stepped forward first, her voice quiet but steady. "Lillian, we owe you an apology." Raymond added, "We were wrong. About the land. About everything." Jean glanced at the women seated behind Lillian and continued, "You've done something beautiful here. We see it now. And more than that, we see you. The bowl of grace." Lillian took a moment before responding. Her face held still, not cold, but calm. Her eyes, dark and knowing, studied the 2 people she had once sacrificed her youth for. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she reached behind her to a small wooden shelf and picked up 2 bowls she had finished the day before. They were simple, off-white with pale green spirals, not unlike the moss that lined the edges of the Ashley River near her childhood home. She handed one to Jean. Then one to Raymond. "These," she said softly, "are the first pieces I've made, just for me." Her words hung in the air. Not dramatic, just honest. "But," she added, with a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips, "if you're here to make things right, to truly begin again, then I'm ready to share. So long as we understand that from now on, sharing means fairness." Jean held the bowl like it was glass. Her fingers trembled. "You were always the strong one. I thought it was quiet strength. But I see now, it was endurance. And we never asked how much it cost you." Raymond cleared his throat. "You taught us to walk, Lily. And we never stopped expecting you to carry us." Healing in layers. The women in the room began nodding. One of them, Marlene, softly wiped her eye. Another patted Lillian's shoulder gently. They didn't know her whole history, but they understood the weight of long-ignored sacrifice. Lillian invited Jean and Raymond to stay for tea. They sat together under the live oak in the back garden, where wind chimes whispered from tree branches and mugs of chamomile steamed in hand-painted cups. Jean watched as other women laughed by the garden beds. "Created all this, Lily, from nothing." "No," Lillian said gently, "I created it from everything I used to give away for free." They sat in silence for a while. A peaceful kind. Memories unfolded. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and twilight drew in, Lillian walked with her siblings through the hallway of the Willow Room. Photos lined the walls, moments captured over the past months, women shaping pots, reading poetry aloud, hugging after classes. Jean paused at one of the photos. It showed Lillian, laughing, arms raised high with wet clay on her apron. "I don't remember the last time I saw you laugh like that," she whispered. Lillian looked at the photo. "That's because I didn't know how to. Not for real. Not until I stopped performing and started living. Raymond chuckled softly. Mom and Dad would be proud. Lillian turned to him, her voice steady but kind. They'd be proud that I finally stood up, even if it was against their idea of family. A new beginning. Before they left, Raymond turned back at the door and asked, "Could we come to one of your classes next week?" Lillian's lips parted in surprise. "To make pottery?" "To learn," he said. "From our big sister." Jean nodded. "And maybe, to make something for you for a change." Lillian smiled. A full, open smile that reached her eyes. "Well then, you better be ready to get your hands dirty." Closing the circle. That night, Lillian cleaned the workroom alone. The scent of clay still lingered in the air, soft and damp and earthy. She ran her hand along the smooth rim of a drying bowl and felt something settle deep in her chest. Not triumph, not revenge, but peace. She sat by the window, sipping warm tea, listening to crickets begin their nightly song. Her journal lay open on the table. She picked up a pen and wrote, "Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's remembering with new understanding. Love doesn't mean becoming small. And healing isn't quiet. It's full of laughter, of voices, of bowls shared in the open sun." Outside, the willow tree swayed in the breeze. And inside, Lillian Monroe, daughter, sister, dreamer, and now teacher, smiled to herself. For she had lived long years in silence. And now, she was heard. The late autumn air drifted through the old windows of the willow room. The leaves outside fluttered with a golden rustle, and inside, the faint earthy scent of drying clay lingered, a warm, grounding scent that reminded Lillian Monroe of beginnings. Real ones. She stood at her favorite table near the window, shaping a soft ball of clay. The rhythm of her hands was slow and intentional, almost meditative. Each movement felt like a conversation between her fingers and a voice that had long been silenced, her own. It had been exactly 1 year since she sold the ancestral land and opened the willow room. 1 year since she was called selfish, dramatic, even ungrateful. 1 year since she decided, for the first time, not to apologize for choosing herself. And what a year it had been. The mirror she never looked into. She often thought about the years before, decades, really, that she had poured into others. Waking up before sunrise to pack school lunches for nieces and nephews. Working double shifts at the library to help pay Raymond's medical bills. Missing every single community ceramics class because Jean needed a babysitter last minute. All those sacrifices had made her feel valuable. At the time. But in truth, they hadn't made her seen. They'd made her convenient. The shift didn't happen overnight. It began as a quiet ache, barely noticeable. A moment here, a sigh there. But it grew louder with each unmet need, each skipped doctor's appointment, each birthday spent alone. And then came that spring meeting, the one where her siblings laughed at her desire to sell the land. That was when something in her cracked, not out of anger, but from a long overdue recognition. They never saw me as a person with dreams. Only as a resource. Speech ballooned the power of no. The hardest word she ever learned to say was no. Not because it hurt others, but because it made her question who she was without the identity of a giver. If she wasn't sacrificing for someone, was she still a good person? A good sister? She remembered one afternoon, shortly after the land was sold, when Jean had shown up at her porch with tears in her eyes. "You sold our land, Lily. What would Mom think?" Lillian had looked at her gently and said, "I think Mom would ask why I waited this long to take care of myself." Jean hadn't responded. Just walked away. But that moment changed something. Not just for Jean. For Lillian too. Because she had finally stood up, not to fight, but to exist. Boldly. A cup of tea, a room of truth. One chilly November evening, after class, one of her students, a quiet widow named Martha, lingered behind. She approached Lillian with clay-streaked hands, holding a crooked little vase. "I know it's not much," Martha said shyly, "but it's the first thing I've made with my hands in 40 years. Lillian took the vase with both hands, as if it were precious china. Her eyes softened. "It's not about the shape," she whispered. "It's about reclaiming the part of you they told you to bury." Martha blinked back tears. That's what you gave us here, Lillian. Permission to come home. To ourselves. That night, as she washed the tools and dimmed the lights, Lillian repeated that sentence in her mind over and over. Permission to come home to myself. How powerful. How quietly revolutionary. A simple, universal truth. Lillian's story was not unique. That's what made it so heartbreaking and so hopeful. Because across the country, there were thousands, millions, of women who had erased themselves gently, bit by bit, in the name of love. But what she had learned was this. Love without boundaries is not love. It is obligation. And obligation wears a woman down until there's nothing left to give. She began writing that truth into journals, sharing it during her weekly circle discussions, etching it onto clay tiles that now lined the garden wall at the Willow Room. One read, family doesn't mean you shrink to fit their comfort. Another, you are allowed to change even if it scares them. And her favorite, a woman who says, no, is not cruel. She is whole. Letters from the past and the future. Months later, Lillian received a handwritten letter from her niece. Aunt Lily, it began, I never told you this growing up, but you were the only adult I felt safe around. You were always there, for everyone. I'm sorry it took me so long to say it. And I'm even sorrier we didn't realize that you needed someone too. There was a $20 bill in the envelope. I sold my first mug on Etsy. I wanted you to have the first piece of it. Lillian laughed softly, folding the letter close to her heart. The path forward on her own terms. She didn't regret giving, not even the painful parts. But now she gave from fullness, not from emptiness. From choice, not pressure. And every time someone walked through the door of the Willow Room, every time a woman in her 60s picked up clay with trembling hands and whispered, I haven't done anything for me in decades, Lillian felt it again. Not pride. Not triumph. But truth. Her words, her life. In her journal that night, she wrote, 66 years. That's how long I lived for others. 1 year. That's how long it took to remember who I am. I'm not just a daughter. Not just a sister. I am not a storage room for other people's guilt. I am a woman who dared to say, I deserve more. And I said it without shouting. Just with clay. And a key to a room I built myself. Outside, the willow tree swayed again in the night breeze. Inside, Lillian Monroe slept with the windows open, unafraid of the dark. She knew who she was now. And she wasn't going back. The morning sun slipped through the tall windows of the Willow Room, casting soft gold across the terracotta floors. Lillian Monroe stood in the center of the workshop, smoothing the edge of a large ceramic bowl. Her hands, though wrinkled and calloused, moved with the graceful confidence of someone who had finally learned not just a craft, but a life philosophy. This was no longer just a quiet studio in Charleston. It was now a name whispered with reverence across 3 states. In the past year, the Willow Room had grown far beyond anything Lillian imagined. What began as a single community space for older women in South Carolina had blossomed into a regional movement. New branches had opened, one nestled in the hills of northern Georgia, the other in the heart of Asheville, North Carolina, both led by women who once sat at Lillian's side, trembling with uncertainty, unsure they deserved more than silence. They now stood tall as directors, mentors, and storytellers. And Lillian? She had become their North Star. Legacy in clay and courage. Each branch of the Willow Room bore the same spirit, healing through hands, through honesty, and through art. The walls were lined not with plaques, but with handwritten notes from women who had once lost their voices, and found them again here. Some read, for the first time in 30 years, I created something that didn't have to be perfect, just mine. I used to be afraid of the quiet. Now I welcome it. That's where I finally heard myself. And on the clay tile above the main entrance in Charleston, etched in bold, you are not too late. You are right on time. That phrase had become the unofficial mantra of the Willow community. And it rang especially true for Lillian. The world begins to listen. When a local journalist first asked to feature her story, Lillian hesitated. She didn't think she had anything remarkable to say. But the writer insisted, you've done what many dream of and few dare. That matters. The article was published under the title, "The Sister Who Said Enough." It quickly made its way through regional publications. Then came invitations to panels, radio interviews, and eventually, an appearance on a national daytime talk show focused on empowering women over 60. Seated beneath bright lights in a modest blue dress, Lillian looked out at the audience of mostly older women, some dabbing their eyes, others nodding silently. And then, with a calm, unwavering voice, she spoke. "I spent my life teaching my siblings how to be decent people. But it wasn't until I turned 66 that I learned how to be myself." The room fell silent. Not with awkwardness, but reverence. She continued, "Being quiet doesn't make you kind. Being accommodating doesn't make you loved. I had to stop confusing sacrifice with self-worth. And the day I stopped pretending to be okay was the first day I actually felt free." The segment aired that Friday. By Monday morning, her inbox was flooded with messages from women all over the country. Some were as young as 30, others in their 70s. They all said the same thing: "Thank you. You gave me permission to stop apologizing for existing." Rewriting the script. A few weeks later, a major publishing house contacted Lillian about turning her journey into a book, a memoir meets guidebook called The Second Kind of Brave. She laughed when she first read the title proposal. "But I'm not brave," she told the editor. The woman on the phone gently replied, "You are. Because you didn't burn bridges. You built doors." The book would feature her story, interwoven with writing exercises she had developed for the women at the Willow Room. Questions like, what would your life look like if you believed you were enough? When did you first start shrinking yourself to keep others comfortable? What does freedom smell like to you? Lillian spent long nights writing. Sometimes with a mug of mint tea, sometimes with tears she didn't expect. Not from pain, but from a deep, overdue sense of acknowledgement. Later that year, Lillian received a phone call from the mayor of Charleston. "You've been nominated as Woman of the Year," he said. "You've done more than open a studio. You've started a revolution for women who were told their time was up." At the ceremony, held in a sunlit hall near the harbor, the announcer read the tribute aloud. At 66, Lillian Monroe stopped asking for space and built it instead. She no longer lives for approval, she lives for truth. She no longer serves quietly, she leads with grace. At 67, she is finally living as a woman, not a role. She accepted the plaque with a quiet nod and whispered, "Thank you," but inside, she felt something far more profound. Not pride. Letters old and new. One afternoon, after returning from a retreat in Asheville, Lillian found a letter waiting in her mailbox. It was from Clara, the old college friend whose first letter had ignited her awakening a year before. This one read, "I visited the Willow Room last week. I didn't say hello. I wanted to just sit in the back and watch. What I saw was a woman who once believed she was too old to start over, leading an orchestra of second chances. You are not the same Lillian I knew. You are more." Lillian folded the letter and tucked it inside her journal. Some things were too precious to put on display. One final lesson. At the end of that year, she stood once again in her Charleston studio, surrounded by students preparing for their end-of-season exhibit. One of the new women, Betty, 71, shy and unsure, asked quietly, "Do you ever miss being the one who stayed silent?" Lillian smiled, smoothing a piece of clay into a curve. "No," she said. "Silence was my armor. But it also became my cage. Now I speak. And when I do, I build. That's a better kind of quiet." The final line. On the cover of Charleston Living magazine, next to a photograph of Lillian in her apron, hands covered in clay, the headline read, "At 34, she gave up her dream. At 66, she reclaimed it. Lillian Monroe no longer suffers for love. She chooses herself at just the right time." And underneath, in her own handwriting, "I'm not late. I just finally arrived."